Hey everybody, welcome to part 3 of my boat video. This is going to be a really long video, but I want to share some of the process of fiberglass repair and bodywork. Because I remember when I first did it, it was really hard to find good sources of information. So hopefully some of the information I give you will help you in some way. In my last videos, I took home a boat that was stored for 8 years and stored it for another 2 years. And then I did some engine repairs and got it running. The next step in my restoration is going to be the least favorite part, which is bodywork. The most critical part of the bodywork on this boat is to make sure it'll float. There were 2 areas where the hull had been punctured, and there was also one large scrape that broke through the fiberglass. So before I even sand, the first thing I do is I clean the area with a strong degreaser like Prep All. Sanding on top of grease and oil will only embed the grease and oil into your work. Sometimes I find an angle grinder is the fastest way to work. Some people are picky about what tools they use. In this situation, they might use a die grinder, but it really doesn't matter because it's the same result. I'm looking for any soft areas. I want to cut those out completely, so I'm only bonding to solid material. I need to create a bevel, like a gradual slope around the hole. This gives more surface area for the new fiberglass to grab onto the old fiberglass. A fiberglass repair doesn't happen through a chemical bond where it melts itself into the old fiberglass. It relies on a mechanical bond where it has to find ways to grab onto the old fiberglass. So the more area it can grab onto, the stronger the repair. Now you can see what I mean. The new fiberglass will have all this area to grab onto rather than just the thin edge of the hole. So I'm sanding with a really coarse sandpaper. This is 36 grit. The scratches made by the sandpaper also help the fiberglass grip. Sometimes I'll bond fiberglass to 60 grit sanding or maybe 180 grit, but you don't want to go a lot finer than that. Now we're going to do the same for this hole up front. Just a note, while I'm doing this work, I'm using a blower to blow the sanding dust away from me so I'm not breathing in the glass fibers. If I'm not using a blower, I'll usually wear a respirator. And now I'm going to fix this deep scratch that's broken through the fiberglass. I'm going to stick some foam in here to fill the void and give the new fiberglass a backer to sit against. Drilling holes into the old fiberglass is called pinning. I always do this on structural fiberglass repairs because it gives repair even more strength. It's like shooting a bunch of rivets to hold 2 pieces together. I like to cut fiberglass fabric before I start working with the resin. This keeps the job a lot cleaner because you're not trying to cut fabric with your hands all sticky with resin. Also, you're not trying to fight the clock to apply the cloth before the resin hardens. I'm making plenty of pieces varying in size, some small enough to fit inside the hole to large enough to cover the entire sanded area. So I'm using fiberglass cloth instead of fiberglass mat, and this is mainly because of the fiberglass resin I'm using. There are 2 main types of fiberglass resins, polyester and epoxy. Polyester fiberglass has been around since the invention of fiberglass. It's old school stuff, but most boats today are still made of polyester resin because it's a lot cheaper than the new stuff, which is epoxy resin. For instance, a gallon of polyester resin is $60. A gallon of epoxy resin is $155. Polyester fiberglass is still a great material though. But epoxy resin is even better in so many ways. It's stronger, it has better adhesion, it shrinks less, better water resistance, and it's easier to work with because it's very low odor. You can repair either type of fiberglass with either type of resin, but epoxy resin is better insurance. And back on the fiberglass material, there's fiberglass mat and fiberglass cloth. Mat is chopped strands of glass, kind of randomly scattered. Cloth is woven in a pattern. Cloth is stronger than mat, and if you're using epoxy resin, you can't use mat. Cloth holds itself together because it's woven. Mat has to be coated in a waxy substance called a binder so the fibers stick together and it stays in the form of a flat sheet. Polyester resin can dissolve the binder in mat, so the resin is able to soak into the mat and stick to the glass fibers. Epoxy resin can't dissolve that binder, So if you use matte with epoxy resin, you'll get weak fiberglass. Don't mix up too much resin. On a small area like this, I make 3 or 4 ounces. Make sure you have some lacquer thinner or acetone handy for cleaning. Fiberglassing is really messy work the first few times you do it. Depending on the temperature, I find you get 15 to 30 minutes of working time before it starts to harden. It's going to start to turn into a gel. And you're not supposed to lay up more than 3 or 4 layers at a time. Both polyester and epoxy resin get hot as it cures, and too much heat makes the fiberglass brittle. So you need to let it harden so it cools before you lay down more layers. So again, just mix up enough to do those 3 or 4 layers. But you don't want it to cure too much. It should still be sticky so the next layer has good adhesion. If you do wait too long though, you'll just have to rough it up with sandpaper before you continue. I end up laying 11 layers of fiberglass. I also did 11 or 12 layers in the hole towards the bow. This scratch didn't look too bad, but it was actually hard enough to break through the fiberglass. That night, I decided to remove all the rub rail since I'll be replacing it. It was riveted like every 6 inches, but the aluminum rivets were pretty easy to drill out. The fiberglass has been hardening for a few days. I'm going to sand down the high spots with 80 grit sandpaper on a short block. As I'm sanding, I'm going in an X pattern, kind of like a crisscross or a crosshatch. This keeps the surface flat and even. If you sand straight in the direction of the sanding block, you'll create lines or ruts that eventually end up looking wavy. Now we're left with a few low spots we'll fill in later. On the hole near the stern I sanded by hand. That was a lot of work. When I'm sanding a long span like this, I use an air file. It takes off a lot of material quickly. On this hole I decided to use a dual action sander. It took 20 or 30 minutes to sand the first hole by hand. With a DA sander, this hole was like 2 minutes. Before I continued, I wanted to remove all the decals. On this boat, there were a lot. And they've had 30-something years to bake onto the paint. I had to try all kinds of tricks: heat, chemicals, scraping. In the end, I settled on a utility knife blade on some locking pliers as a handle. The blade was sharp and I dug into the gel coat in a lot of places. I'll have to fill all those with body filler later. And then I removed the windows and anything else that was going to get in the way of painting. There were also these snaps for a boat cover riveted all around the boat. I drilled and punched them out. There were probably 100 of these too. Then I used a die grinder with a rasp bit to sand the holes so the body filler has some surface to grab onto. Before I apply body filler, there's some adhesive left from the stickers. I tried removing it with lacquer thinner, but that didn't work. So I'm just going to sand it off. Again, I'm using 80 grit sandpaper. Now that the fiberglass is completely cured, I need to rough up the low spots that didn't get sanded earlier, so the body feeler has something to grab onto. There's some scratches here I might as well fill in while I'm at it. The process of doing bodywork on cars and boats are mostly the same. The products are mostly the same as well, but in a few places they're a little different. One of those places is body filler. Auto body filler is made of polyester resin, the same stuff in fiberglass, and some kind of powder like talc. Auto body filler is really porous, so it soaks up water. On a boat, especially below the waterline, you're supposed to use marine body filler, which is made of epoxy or vinyl ester resin and some sort of powdered glass instead of talc. Marine body filler is better in all kinds of ways, like water resistance, adhesion, and durability. The only downsides are cost and it's harder to sand. I have all the materials for making my own marine body filler from working on surfboards. All you need is epoxy resin and powdered glass. The powdered glass comes in the form of fumed silica, or often referred to by its trade name, Cabosil. Fumed silica thickens the epoxy resin so you can spread it and it'll hold its shape. First you mix your resin and hardener. Different brands will have different mixing ratios. Then you just keep adding as much fumed silica as you think you need. You want it to keep its shape and not sag. Before I apply body filler, I degrease again with Prep-All. My goal is to apply a little more filler than I need to fill the low spots, and then I'll come back and sand off the excess. But I don't want to pile it on too much because sanding is a lot of work. The epoxy filler also takes a lot longer to harden before you can sand. I give it at least 6 hours. With auto body filler, you can usually sand within maybe 15-20 minutes. I'm using a long block to make sure I leave a nice flat surface. This block is made by DuraBlock. It's nice for slightly curved surfaces like this because it's a little flexible and you can actually bend it into a curve and it'll keep the shape for a few minutes. If you use too short of a block or too soft of a pad, you're going to end up with waves or ripples. Again, I sand in a crisscross pattern so I don't make lines or ruts. You also don't want to use too much pressure because that'll also leave an uneven surface. Don't be afraid to change your sandpaper often when it gets clogged. You always start off with a coarse grit like 80 grit to quickly knock down the high spots. Right now we're just trying to establish the general shape. Here I'm using another type of long block. This one's stiff and doesn't flex at all. I use this on surfaces that are completely flat. You'll know when to stop sanding when the sandpaper starts digging into the surrounding area. This is one of the biggest mistakes people make when sanding. They over sand because they're trying to force the low spots to disappear. You definitely want to stop if you've sanded past the original gel coat and you can actually see raw fiberglass. You'll see here that there are low spots around the patched area. That's because when the hole was poked into the side of the boat, it dented this whole area. I don't want to keep sanding to force the low spots to disappear because then all I'm doing is spreading the dent over a wider area. It really helps to use what's called a guide coat to reveal the low spots. Here I'm using black primer as a guide coat. Once the guide coat has dried, I sand it with a finer grit sandpaper like 180 or 320, and the low spots will show as dark spots. Don't expect to have your dents fixed in one session of filing and sanding. I usually gotta repeat 3 or 4 times before I get it perfect. After sanding with 80 grit and you're satisfied there are no more high spots and low spots, then you sand with 180 grit to remove the 80 grit sanding marks. Then 320 grit to remove the 180 grit sanding marks. I can stop at 320 grit because I'm going to be spraying the entire boat with primer. If you want to be safe, you can even sand with 600 grit, but I find primer will usually hide 320 grit sanding marks. And the sanding goes on for hours and hours and days. Sanding is the worst part of bodywork because it's a lot of work with little satisfaction. But if you don't do it thoroughly, it's all going to show up later when you paint. I'm walking the entire boat and marking every spot that needs work. So far I've been using my homemade epoxy and silica filler, but for the final filling I'm using regular auto body filler. It's a lot easier to sand and leaves a smoother finish. If you're working above the waterline, you can use regular body filler for all your repairs. It's important to use epoxy filler or marine filler below the waterline though. I'm giving the bottom of the hull the same treatment, sanding, epoxy filler, and sanding again. There's one last place I need to do some fiberglass work. The old plastic vents were in bad shape, so I got some new stainless steel vents. The new vents are shorter but wider than the old ones, so I need to fill in the height of the holes and cut them wider. After I'm done with all the bodywork, I go over the entire boat with 320 grit sanding, even the areas that didn't need any work, because remember, the primer needs a rough surface to grab onto. This boat is now ready to be washed, then I'll mask off any areas I don't want painted, like the outdrive. I'm pretty sure this bodywork is going to be the most difficult, most time-consuming, and least satisfying part of this restoration, so I'm glad it's over. In the next video, we'll primer and paint. And maybe I'll feel like I'm actually getting somewhere.